Okay, I'm going to talk about cell structure and function today. So remember when we did that little microscope activity at the beginning of the year and you had to identify that and find the thickness of a human hair. And we kind of calculated the human hair was about 100 micrometers. That funny little U thing is actually a Greek M, a micrometer. And the thickness of a human hair is just about as far as our eye can see, the naked eye. So in order to view cell structures such as eukaryotic cells or prokaryotic cells or internal eukaryotic structures called organelles, we need to use a light microscope. And the light microscope you've seen looks like that. We've used it before, and I'm going to be asking you to make a lot of drawings of what you see under the microscope. And when I say make a drawing of what you see under the microscope, don't draw the table. But in a more serious note, when we're looking at, for example, human cheek cells, some of you guys are going to look at it and you're just going to draw a bunch of dots. Dot, 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 dot. Well, the reason we're using a light microscope is so that we can actually see these internal structures and we can see this detail. So take some time, actually get it focused under medium or high power, not just low power, so you can actually see these internal structures. Okay. Another thing we reviewed, we talked about cells. All life is made up of one or more cells, and we talked about the two main types of cells are prokaryotic and eukaryotic. And think for a minute, what was the main difference between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell? Well, if we look at these diagrams, you can see that all cells, all living cells, have a cell membrane or a plasma membrane around them. So that's not a difference. They also have this internal fluid called cytoplasm. Cyto means cell, plasm means fluid. They have this internal fluid. All living things also have DNA, one of the important macromolecules, the genetic code of life. So all cells contain DNA. But then we get down, ribosomes produce proteins, and you can see that prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells have ribosomes. But then the last thing on here is the nucleus, right, that is in the eukaryotic cell and not the prokaryotic cell. The prokaryotic cell has this area called a nucleoid region. That's basically where the DNA is, but it's not bound into an internal nucleus, a membrane-bound structure. And if we want to expand on that structure, we can see that the eukaryotic cell also has other membrane-bound structures, like that one, and these, and all of this. So really, we can say prokaryotic cells, when we look at it, they lack not only a nucleus, but they lack other membrane-bound structures. And the term we use for these membrane-bound structures within a cell are organelles. That means literally little organs. So we could say a eukaryotic cell has a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. Okay, so if we look at this cell right here, I can see there's DNA in there, but I notice that DNA is not bound in a nice little membrane. It's not bound in a nucleus. We have other kind of molecules in here, but they're not sort of containerized in nice little internal structures. So this is an example of a prokaryotic cell. This is called Bacillus polymixa. It's a soil bacteria very closely related to anthrax, a very deadly soil bacterium you may have heard of. But anyway, it's a good example of a prokaryotic cell. So if we compare plant and animal cells, we can see they're both eukaryotic. They have a lot of membrane-bound organelles, including the nucleus in both of them. But we also see there's some important differences too. So let's talk about some of the differences. Number one, plant cells have this very rigid structure around them. It's called a cell wall. Animal cells are just surrounded by a cell membrane. So that's going to be an important difference when we look at these plant and animal cells in the lab. Another important difference is plant cells have this very large central vacuole here. It contains water and it keeps them pressurized. It gives them what's called turgor pressure, so the plants can stand upright and be properly inflated. Animal cells don't have that large central vacuole. They have smaller vacuoles that might store food or waste, but not a large central vacuole. And then a third thing the plant cell has is, remember, plant cells can produce their own energy from the sun. And certain photosynthetic plant cells have these structures called chloroplasts. Chloroplasts have chlorophyll, a molecule that can capture the sun's energy and make sugar, make food for the plant. Again, animal cells have to get their energy from other living things. We're consumers, not producers, so we lack those chloroplasts. One thing that animal cells do have compared to plant cells are these structures called centrioles. Centrioles play an important role when a cell is about to divide. We'll talk about cell division in a couple weeks, but when we do, we'll talk about these centrioles anchoring this structure called a spindle. It's a scaffolding upon which chromosomes are pulled apart. Other structures found in animal cells, not in plant cells, are lysosomes. These contain digestive enzymes, and they help the plants destroy dead material or foreign substances. Okay, so those are some important differences between plant and animal cells. They're both eukaryotic, but they have some different internal structures or organelles. So looking at plant cells, these are similar to some cells you're going to look at in a plant cell called an onion cell. These are dead cells. There's no living structures. These are just air bubbles in there. So anytime you see a perfectly round object in a cell, it's probably an air bubble. Nothing in these cells, but there are still obviously a visible structure, right? That outer container that makes them all look kind of brick-like, and those are cell walls. Remember from our biochemistry unit, cell walls are composed of an important molecule that we talked about. Do you remember what that was? Cellulose, right? So cellulose is a polysaccharide made out of glucose polymers, and it provides the structure for plants. We can't digest it, so when we eat plant cell walls, it goes right through us. We call it dietary fiber. But plant cell walls provide structure for plant cells, and they are made of an important molecule called cellulose. So let's go in from the cell wall. Inside the cell, all cells, plant and animal cells, contain these phospholipids, and phospholipids form this bilayer. Remember, we have these polar phosphate heads. They are hydrophilic, water-loving, and then we have these hydrophobic, water-hating fatty acids in here. So when we put these together, they tend to form what's called a phospholipid bilayer, and they're an important part of the cell membrane. Cell membranes surround all cells, plant and animal cells, even bacterial cells, prokaryotic cells have a cell membrane, and they're important because they are selectively permeable. They allow things into and out of the cell. So they're kind of like the bouncer at the front door. Let in certain people, don't let in other people, and they can help the cell maintain homeostasis and maintain what it needs. If we want a closer look, it's not just phospholipids in the cell membrane, it's actually what we call a fluid mosaic model. Fluid meaning it's got fluidity, it moves around. A mosaic is, again, a bunch of pieces that work together for an overall design. So we have proteins in there, right? And we have, of course, phospholipids. And then we have cholesterols. They're a type of lipid, ring lipid. They help give some structure to the membrane. We have glycolipids and glycoproteins. We'll talk about what they do in a couple days. But again, it's this fluid mosaic. It's a lot of components in the cell membrane that allows it to do what it needs to do. Moving into the cell from outside, now we're at the cell headquarters, right? And the headquarters of the cell is called the nucleus. It controls cell function. So if we think of the cell as like a city, this is like City Hall. And the mayor's in there with the instructions, and the instructions are this molecule called chromatin. Chromatin is basically the molecule DNA when it's in its unraveled form. When it's wrapped up, it's called chromosomes, but when it's unraveled, it's chromatin. And it's going to instruct the cell on what to do, when to divide, when to die, when to produce more proteins, what proteins to produce. All those functions are coordinated in the center of the cell called the nucleus. And again, all eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. Just outside the nucleus, you can see are these tiny little dots. Some of them are found on this membrane, some of them are just free-floating, but these tiny little dots are called ribosomes. And ribosomes are really important in cells because they allow cells to make proteins. And again, proteins have all these important roles we talked about. They are structural, they can transport things, they can act as hormones and antibodies and all this stuff. So all these important functions are produced on these structures called ribosomes. So we can think of, again, the cities like a cell. These are like the factories in the city. These are producing all the important things that need to be produced in this cell. Okay, and that is it. We'll talk about the rest of the cell structures in the next video.